All right, so it's like 1 a.m. here. I'm going to be a little quiet when I record this, but I can't believe I didn't find this sooner. But apparently on April 24th, 12 U.S. senators signed their name on a threat to the ICC, which is the International Criminal Court. This seems, though certainly on brand for the United States, not wanting anything to do with international court. The U.S. is notorious for distancing itself from international law and being opposed to it. But this letter is so ridiculous and out of touch with the facts of the matter that I question whether or not it's real. But if it is, the 12 signatures on this list are certainly admitting to being complicit in genocide, because there is literally no way that these 12 people could be this ignorant about the situation that's been happening for the past 6 months. So if we find that this letter addressed to the ICC is not real, I will gladly take down this video. But if this is authentic, it's very telling in a lot of ways. So I'm going to read this sentence by sentence and dismantle everything that we know to be false. Full disclosure, I'm not a historian. I have just recently started paying attention. I think it was the coverage about the October 7th attacks that made me curious and made me start researching the genesis of how all this really began. Because I do know some history, and the history that I know about colonization has certainly used all of the same rhetoric to justify colonial violence, such as occupation or ethnic cleansing. So I'll begin reading the letter. Dear Mr. Khan, we write regarding the reports that the International Criminal Court, ICC, may be considering issuing international arrest warrants for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other Israeli officials. Such actions are illegitimate and lack legal basis. So this is where we already have to pause. Because this is such a horrendously false claim that investigating Benjamin Netanyahu and other Israeli officials who make decisions leading to the genocide in Gaza, the amount of war crimes that have been recorded just from smartphones alone that prove the IDF has committed an obscene amount of war crimes. The amount of footage is just wild. So one might argue, well then, that's just the soldiers committing war crimes, and therefore Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is, somehow exempt from this. But Netanyahu has time and time again said things openly to the press that would lead one to believe quite plainly that he is in favor of all of the war crimes that have ensued. And when we look at the amount of negotiations that Hamas has put forward to to return hostages and make permanent ceasefires, and how many of those have been rejected. And sorry, I should have just fucking. I'm going to pause. I'm actually just going to pull up every one of those so that I can get the numbers right and the dates correct. The first was on October 9th. The second was on October 16th. The third was on October 17th. The fourth was October 28th. The fifth was January 2nd. The sixth was January 18th. The seventh was January 22nd. The eighth was February 2nd. The ninth was March 15th. The 10th was May 6th. So, the point there being that there is a personal responsibility to the leadership disregarding all of these ceasefire attempts or hostage negotiations, and instead opting to continue what's been going on, which is, of course, genocide and a litany of other war crimes. So let's get back to the letter. And if carried out, will result in severe sanctions against you and your institution. So this is, again, these 12 senators threatening the ICC and stating that if they go after Benjamin Netanyahu with international arrest warrants, these senators will attempt to force consequences upon the ICC. So this is literally, it's just a threat. There's really not much to talk about there. To continue reading, the ICC is attempting to punish Israel for taking legitimate actions of self-defense against their Iranian-backed aggressors. So there's a bunch of things wrong with this sentence. Taking legitimate actions of self-defense. This is referring to the roughly 1,000, maybe it was 1,200 or something like that, Israelis who were killed in the October 7th attack. That's what this is referring to. And there is no international law that I have ever seen, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no international law that allows a nation a right of self-defense for its occupied territories. For obvious reasons. If someone is invading a territory, how do they have a right to defend that territory? It's not their territory. It's not their land. Of course they don't have a right of self-defense there. It's absurd. And that's, of course, why there are no international laws that just, allow colonial nations to take something and then be allowed to defend it. So there's also this really weird assumption: Iranian-backed aggressors. First of all, this paints all Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank, Gaza being what is controlled by Hamas, the West Bank having nothing to do with them. But this is assuming that all Palestinians are aggressors, because the reason people such as myself and most of the world are really pissed off about the sheer scale of brutality and mass killing is because it's so reckless and it's not targeted to the aggressors, which again is referring to Hamas. And we also have to ask ourselves, what does self-defense mean in the context of a country defending itself? Now, obviously, It's tragic when a terrorist act causes 1,000 civilians to be killed. But if we recognize that tragedy, then we have to recognize that every single day since, for the past 6 months, right now I'm recording this on May 9th. So how many days has this been? Go back week by week. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 28, 29, 30, 31 weeks and some change. But 31 times 7, that's how many days civilians have been being killed by the IDF. So it's weird to attempt to justify violent civilian killing actions over one violent civilian killing action, if that makes sense. Let me try to find a better way to articulate this. So that's 217 days of Israeli violence against Palestinian people. And this is intended to be seen as self-defense for 1 day of violence against Israeli people. Now, if you're familiar with history at all, you know that that's, of course, just the rhetoric. It has nothing to do with the actual intentions of the colonizing force. It's mainly a PR thing. They want to have a plausible deniability to their violence, and so narratives are created to make it seem like it's necessary to try to wipe people off the map so that they can take the land from them. This was never intended to be self-defense. This is actually, when Hamas attacked on October 7th, this was immediately co-opted, and I'm sure the IDF was glad that it happened, in the sense that it now gave them a green light, now that the guns were pointed in their direction, to just to claim victimhood and just go full throttle on the genocide they've been wanting to do for years. But all right, that's that sentence. We'll get back to reading the letter. In fact, you, in your own words, you witnessed, quote, scenes of calculated cruelty conducted by Hamas in Israel following the October 7th attacks. All right, so this sentence, again, talking about that one instance and stating that the ICC agrees that Hamas's attacks were calculated cruelty. This is almost irrelevant. Again, we're talking, if you want to talk calculated cruelty, what's bombing hospitals? What's dropping supplies to get people in a location and 10 minutes later dropping bombs on the locations you drop supplies to? What's telling people to evacuate and bombing them while they're doing it? What's destroying water supplies? What's destroying the exits so that people cannot fucking leave the open air concentration camps that the IDF forced upon the Palestinian people? So if we're talking calculated acts of cruelty, despite Hamas's terrorist attack being tragic, it's almost laughable to compare the two, because the IDF has done so much worse for so much longer. All right, back to the letter. These arrest warrants would align the ICC with the largest state sponsor of terrorism and its proxy. This is shocking to me. All right. If we want to understand this sentence, it blows my mind that anyone from the United States would play this card, because I'm sure that Noam Chomsky and Norm Finkelstein and the Mates would agree with me when I say that the United States, being the largest military, just handing A-grade weaponry to the fourth largest military to destroy the Palestinian people, I think that is the greatest example of the largest state sponsor of terrorism, because it's a state sponsor of genocide. So when I read this sentence, this is where I almost can't believe that this document is real. Because did they not have proofreaders? And 12 of them read this? And they thought it was a good idea to include this sentence? Do they think history books don't exist? What information do they think is not on the internet? The United States has sponsored terrorism every chance it got if there were resources to be gained from it. I mean, look at what we did. God, you see, just look at what we've done all over the place. Look what we did to Panama. Look what we did to Colombia. Look what we did to Guatemala. Look what we did to Hawaii. The U.S. is historically incredibly pro-terrorism and sponsors it with a heavy hand. But we'll get back to reading this letter. To be clear, there is no moral equivalence between Hamas's terrorism and Israel's justified response. Now, again, we talked about how Israel's response was not justified, and this sentence is kind of right. There is no moral equivalence. Moral equivalence implies parity, an almost equal, or at least somewhat similar level of capability between the two. And it's just not the case. Israel is incredibly powerful, and the reason a group like Hamas can come to power is because of a blatant desperation against its colonizers. So if we really want to understand this idea of moral equivalence, we have to talk about the fact that this has been going on for decades. And it's been clear that every attempt to protest for the Palestinian people to protest against their own colonization nonviolently has been quelled and thwarted. And what you have to understand, whether you agree with organizations like Hamas or not, you have to understand the causality that leads these kinds of groups to exist. And the way Martin Luther King said that riots are the language of the unheard, if you completely silence the voice of an entire people for decades, eventually they're going to stop trying to talk and are going to take action, and they're going to try to rip the walls down that imprison them. So it's almost akin to a slave insurrection when I look at this in terms of, if we're talking moral equivalence, or what are the moral push, the moral motivation. It's just really clear to me that had peace and not being colonized been really on the table, Hamas would have never existed in the first place. But we'll get back to the letter. The ICC is also prohibited by its charter from proceeding in any case unless the relevant government is unwilling or unable to police themselves. I don't understand why this sentence is here. Every corrupt government will be unwilling to police itself, period. So we can just skip over that one. It's a stupid waste of digital ink. You yourself has said Israel has trained lawyers who advise commanders and a robust system intended to ensure the compliance with international humanitarian law. By issuing warrants, you would be calling into question the legitimacy of Israel's law, legal system, and democratic form of government. Okay, so first of all, whether these trained lawyers are advising commanders or not, we see droves upon droves of war crimes being committed by the IDF. So it almost doesn't matter. Either these lawyers are trained and are advisors and are just constantly being ignored, or this should all be taken into question. So when it says by issuing warrants, you would be calling into question the legitimacy, yeah, that's exactly what we should do when people are getting annihilated. We're talking like 45,000 people now in the course of 6 months. Some of the highest rates of infant or children deaths, and some of the highest rates of the press being killed. It's wild. This should question the legitimacy of Israel's laws and legal system, right? And this idea of Israel being a democratic form of government, that is completely fucking untrue. And the reason it's untrue isn't because maybe it does claim to be a democracy, but it is a heavily propagandized state. It is so much a heavily propagandized state that it is. Here are some ways you can see it. When you see the photos of people cheering on the hill while Gaza's being bombed, that's something taught. All right, people don't just innately hate each other. There are either, severe reasons for that kind of taking glee at the mass murder of others, or having been lied to your entire life. And I think probably a better example is the photos of Israeli children blocking the humanitarian aid trucks from getting into Palestine. Now, 8-year-old kids do not just choose to hate people that they've never met. All right, that is, to me, those images are heartbreaking, and I really feel bad for those kids. I really feel bad for the Israeli children who were told all their life that these Palestinians are a huge threat, and that you should take pleasure in watching them die, and that you should stop medical aid from getting to them. Because when these kids come of age and look back on what the history books and what every other nation sees is going on, because it's so heavily propagandized that they don't see what's really going on. They see a narrow, for the most part, I mean, I'm sure a lot of the people are scouring the internet for everything they can find about the actual facts of the matter. But when these kids grow up, they're going to be furious. They're going to be appalled that they tried to starve children while they were children. They're going to be upset. They're going to be pissed off at their parents for leading them astray. They're going to be pissed off at the Israeli government because, you know, an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid wanting to starve other children, that is not something that would happen in a democratic government. It's so heavily propagandized that you can make children hate children they've never met. This is not democracy. This is manufactured consent for sure. All right, we'll get back to the letter. Issuing arrest warrants for the leaders of Israel would not only be unjustified. Okay, well, we already dispelled that sentence. We'll go on to the next sentence. It would expose your organization's hypocrisy and double standards. Your office has not issued arrest warrants for Iran's supreme leader, then they name him, or any other Iranian official, Syrian president, again they name, or any other Syrian official or Hamas leader. That's untrue. I don't know anything about these other guys, but yeah, the ICC is certainly investigating Hamas. No shit. All right, after that sentence, it says, nor have you issued an arrest warrant for the genocidal General Secretary of the People's Republic of China. Infuriating that they use genocidal here as a derogatory thing against, I don't know anything about China. I don't. But they just said the quiet part out loud. They used the word genocide, and it's not referring to what the IDF is doing to the people of Palestine. That is almost laughable. And the inclusion of this word really makes me wonder if this sentence, the whole thing is real or not, or if these senators, they can't possibly be this ignorant, right? So it blows my mind. And then it goes on to say that other Chinese officials should be, I guess, arrested. That's the implication here. But the next paragraph, finally, neither Israel nor the United States are members of the ICC and are therefore outside your organization's supposed jurisdiction. Yeah, well, no shit. The United States routinely stays out of the jurisdiction of international law, and for good reason. So this didn't even really need to be said. It's just a weird flex that international law is something that powerful countries can just say fuck you to. But anyway, next sentence. If you issue a warrant for the arrest of the Israeli leadership, we will interpret this not only as a threat to Israel's sovereignty, but to the sovereignty of the United States. First of all, that makes no fucking sense. All right? If we're talking about this sentence, there's no way that you could justify that rationally. Because a foreign prime minister being arrested for war crimes is clearly not an existential threat to a country that it's not that one. It's, the United States. What happens to members of leadership in Israel is not an existential threat to a country outside itself. Just duh. All right, next sentence. Our country demonstrated in the American Service Members Protection Act the lengths to which we will go to protect that sovereignty. I don't know what they're referring to here, but I've not been impressed with the United States' attempts at protecting sovereignty, period. Next sentence. The United States will not tolerate politicized attacks by the ICC or other allies, or our allies. Target Israel and we will target you. If you move forward with the measures indicated in this report, we will move to end all American support to the ICC, sanction your employees and associates, and bar you and your families from the United States. You have been warned. That last part is just a very interesting threat, right? We're going to bar you from the U.S. if you do your jobs, if you investigate, find war crimes are done, and issue arrest warrants. We're coming for you. That's what the U.S. It's not what the U.S. It's what these pro-genocide senators, and I'll list their names. I think it's kind of them to sign their complicity with genocide and their support for mass murder. It's certainly not a choice I would make if I were in their shoes, but these senators are Tom Cotton, Mitch McConnell, Marsha Blackburn, Kati Britt, Ted Budd, Kevin Cramer, Ted Cruz, Bill Hagerty, Pete Ricketts, Marco Rubio, Rick Scott, Tim Scott. Now, someone with a lot more knowledge than me probably could have picked this thing apart even worse than I did, because again, I'm less than a year into studying this particular geopolitical problem. So I'm sure Chomsky or Finkelstein could probably write pages on how off base this is. But I honestly don't think it's worth their time. I think it's so flimsy that not only even someone like me who a year ago knew nothing about this, anyone with any remotely accurate understanding of the United States and its foreign policies would just be able to pick this thing apart, even if you knew nothing about what was going on between Gaza and the West Bank. And now Rafah. God, fucking ridiculous. But anyway, this has gone on long enough. Thanks, and I guess we'll just keep resisting, right? What else are we going to do? This is fucking nuts. Have a good night, everybody.